It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jim LoGerfo to all of you. And I remember Dr. LoGerfo from my residency days. And in addition to being a gifted physician, he was a gifted director at Harborview. And he has something that's remarkable, not only a very smart man, but a very kind man. He received his MD degree from the University of Rochester and his Master's in Public Health from the University of Washington. A director of the UW Health Promotion Research Center, lead center in terms of disease control and prevention in the Healthy Aging Network. He's an attending at Harborview Medical Center and the Adult Medicine Clinic. He's the previous medical director of Harborview before Dr. Barnhart. Is that right, Jim? And he's on the board of directors of the Comprehensive Health Education Foundation. So would you please welcome Dr. James LoGerfo.
Thanks, Terry. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening. First, a couple of disclaimers. The first disclaimer is that I'm not a geriatrician, and indeed my main claim to geriatrics and my main contribution at the University of Washington was probably in the mid-1980s when I was serving as acting chief of that unit and was able to help recruit Dr. Abras here. And then a few years after that, I had the privilege of having Wayne McCormick in a training program that I was a co-director of. We always call these people trainees, but they're just gifted people who come through and you touch them on the shoulder and say, I once worked with that individual. And fortunately, we didn't mess Wayne up too much, and he's gone on and also contributed greatly to geriatrics. So those are my main contributions. Most of the work I'll be talking about tonight really relates to work that's been going on in a research center that I now have the privilege of directing, the Health Promotion Research Center, that focuses on trying to develop community-based programs to promote healthy aging. Now, why should we care about community-based programs to promote healthy aging? We're docs. We see patients in clinics. We see patients in the hospital. There's that whole other world out there. Well, let's consider a pretty typical case. Mrs. Jones is a 72-year-old diabetic woman. She lives alone in South Seattle. She's doing pretty good, except she did fall walking on some uneven pavement about 1 month ago. She has some arthritis, some joint pain. She's had no loss of consciousness or dizziness then or since. When you examine her, she's a slightly elevated body mass index of 28, not terrible. Her cardiovascular and neurologic exam all look pretty good, so no obvious causes for her falling. You do a test called the timed up and go, where you have her sit in a chair, stand up, walk 8 feet, go around a little object and come back and sit down. And that takes her 12 seconds, which is a little worrisome because it means that some of her fall, she has perhaps some gait disturbance, or she has a fear of falling, so she's a little bit slow on that. You note she's a little bit less animated than usual. For diabetes control, these numbers shown here are numbers that are a lot better than some patients we see, but not where we would like them to be. And she thinks that they're pretty good because she doesn't really quite know what her goals are. And she has no regular walking activities and no physical activity at a moderate level. So as a physician, seeing her, this is a very typical case, and what it illustrates is a very complex interaction between chronic disease, sedentary lifestyle, social isolation, and depression. And in order to achieve some of those healthy behaviors that we saw in Dr. Abras's slides, we really have to deal with this interaction amongst these. It's not any single one of these that we have to deal with. At a superficial level, a program for Mrs. Jones is pretty straightforward. Let's get her in a comprehensive physical activity program. Now, for comprehensive, by that we mean aerobic, strength, balance, and flexibility, all four. Since she doesn't seem to understand some of her goals of diabetes, maybe we should get her into some self-management skill-building classes where she takes primary control, knows her goals, and actually comes in banging on your door telling you she's not where she should be. What can we do together to get there? You might want to consider depression management. And depending as you explore her social connectedness, you might want to consider some formal social activation. So those are pretty straightforward. In the usual clinical talk, we would just say, here's a list of things to do. But options really vary markedly depending on who Mrs. Jones is. I really haven't given you much of a context of her life. I think as a paraphrase from Jesse Jackson, something like content without context is pretext or something, and something along those lines. And in Mrs. Jones's case, the options will vary enormously by her socioeconomic status and cultural values. Take some simple things. Ms. Jones, you know, we've talked about walking a lot. Why don't you just start walking? Just get yourself a good pair of walking shoes and, you know, let's get going with that. A pair of walking shoes can cost 10 or more % of a person's income if they're on Social Security. If she's well-to-do, like some of my patients, say, oh, that's no problem. I'll get a personal trainer, I'll join a club, and off I go. Where do you go walking in places, if you're Mrs. Jones in Southeast Seattle, when during one 4-month spread last year, there were 72 muggings of women during the daytime for their purses? What do you do when she can't afford walking shoes? She can't afford to go to a gym. She can't afford to go to a health club. The buses in Southeast Seattle don't go anywhere near where she needs to get for some of the better walking places where her house is. On the other hand, if she's fortunate and lives in a part of Southeast Seattle, say Long Seward Park, has well-to-do background, all of these things might be very easy to do. So a critical issue, if we want to think about closing the gaps and disparities of care and outcomes of care and health between the rich and poor in our society, really is dependent on developing approaches which bring people like Mrs. Jones into the ability to have the same kind of healthy behaviors that many of us enjoy. Now, there's a critical model for chronic care that many of you may have seen or heard about. This is developed by our colleague Ed Wagner at the Group Health Center for Health Studies. And this posits a number of things that you want to have go on in the clinical system. You'd like to have the docs have good decision support, maybe some computer systems to remind them that you haven't had certain tests and so on. You might want to have the clinic set up so that they do all those mini mental statuses and so on that Dr. McCormick showed. And somewhere over here in this box of the chronic care model, they say if we want to have good outcomes of chronic care, we have to be able to link people to good resources and policies in the community. And ultimately, these will result in an informed and activated patient, a prepared clinical team to deal with their issues, and you'll have better outcomes. So this is kind of a model that it talks a lot about the kind of clinical setting. But again, the context for people is this broader social ecologic model. And so you'll hear this model referred to a lot. It's a socio-ecologic model of health, not of healthy aging, where we have individuals and they can do behavior change based on some cognitive knowledge, perhaps just knowing certain things or whatever might help them. This is the usual notion of health education. If we just tell them this, that's a Tommy Thompson approach. We just need to tell these people to get out there and walk, and they'll all go walking and it'll be a healthier country. That may or may not be so easy. There's a whole issue of interpersonal connectedness. It's a lot easier to go walking when you get home at the end of the day or so on. You're tired, it's cold and rainy out, and you really don't want to go, but your spouse or significant other says, hey, you know, let's get going. And you support each other in that. Institutional issues. Where are the places for people to do things like good physical activity? Where do they exist in a community? What about the community level? What about issues of public safety in a community? What about issues of safe sidewalks? What about issues of sidewalks? There are large chunks of King County, even in relatively high-density residential areas, which don't have sidewalks. And what about some public policy issues around good physical environments? So if we want to take an approach to try to figure out how to help people like Mrs. Jones be physically active in a community, we really need to think of approaches that address all of these. And this is somewhat alluded to in a definition I would give you for healthy aging. The first paragraph and first sentence on this is a very typical definition of health that you would see from the World Health Organization. It's the optimal physical, mental, and social well-being. But the second paragraph really lays out some of the enabling characteristics and the times under which this is most likely to occur. And this really gets at the social ecologic model. So if we want to develop some programs to try to make things easier for people like Mrs. Jones, if she happens to be living on Social Security, living alone, not a lot of money, not a lot of family supports. What are some of the options in thinking about community-based approaches? And now I'll shift to summarizing some work that's been done in the center, the Health Promotion Research Center that I direct. All of this work was done by colleagues before I arrived, or well in place before I arrived, so I take little credit for any of this. But the first is to think about places that focus on people like Mrs. Jones. So one would be senior centers. There are about 15,000 in this country. They vary all over the map, from community nonprofit to government-run. They vary markedly in services. Some have just simple hot lunch programs every day. Some have more social activities. Some are extremely vibrant places with literally hundreds and hundreds of volunteers doing incredible things. But there is this network out there which offers some hope. There's a network of things called area agencies on aging, and these receive federal funds that get passed through the states. And in King County, it's the Aging and Disability Services, ADS, which is the area agency on aging. So they provide money to community agencies to do things like have congregate meal programs and so on. And I'll come back to how they've been helpful to us. And then if one wants to try to develop programs that works in these settings, and that might be helpful to seniors, the question comes of what kind of research projects you design. So there's a lot of interest now in something called community-based participatory research. So this is a genre of research where at the very beginning you start working with the community partners that are going to be involved in your work and who will need to be the ones who sustain it when you're done. This means that you don't do a study where you hire a PhD-trained psychologist, physical education specialist to sit in a private physician's office to see if having that person talk with a patient helps them become more active. That's not a model that's going to ever be sustained anywhere. If you think of where most people go to get their care and who's going to pay for those services and so on. So it really means thinking about the agencies where these things are likely to play out and trying to do appropriate work. In effect, what you're ultimately trying to do in this kind of work is to try to deal with issues of what's available for resources in some of these senior centers. What do we know from scientific evidence, from the people on the treadmills and so on that we've seen, heard about, how these benefits can happen? And what about community and cultural values as we design physical activity programs? As we design programs that are appropriate for Khmer-speaking Cambodian elders, Somali elders, Hispanic elders, African American elders, Native American elders. How do we think about programs that will be appropriate for those individuals and really draw on some of their cultural strengths to engage them? Now, often when we think about healthy aging, we think about disease syndromes, osteoporosis, heart disease, and so on. And that gives you a list something like this. So we could talk about physical activity related to these things. And you heard a lot of that from Dr. Abras. Physical activity doesn't relate to all of these things, but this is a typical spectrum of the kinds of problems older adults face. There are individual diseases like heart disease. There are syndromes like pain. Pain's not really a disease. It might be caused by a disease, but many diseases cause pain. And then there's things like frailty. What does frailty mean? You know, we kind of recognize it. We see these, you know, little people, old people walking across the street, you know, looking very slow and tenuous and so on. But really, how do we measure that, and how do we define that, and how do we just call it frailty. It's a kind of a syndrome. An easier way to look at it is look at the things that cut across all of these, and we're going to focus today on physical activity, of course. But these are the other things that are in Dr. Abras' slide, and I would really highlight the top and the bottom on this. So in terms of things that relate to physical activity and engaging seniors, there have been regionally, and there are similar programs that have been developed elsewhere, but these are three really hallmark programs that have been developed in here and have had a lot of national interest. The first is a program that was originally called Lifetime Fitness and is now called Enhanced Fitness. And the study for this is a program that emphasizes getting people who are very sedentary to be able to get up to have moderate level of physical activities. So these are people who are really couch potatoes and getting them to the point where they can walk briskly, where they're getting slightly short of breath, might do some resistance training and so on. It's a program that can be it's a social model. People come to a class for a while, but it can easily be done at home. It's safe for frail and near frail seniors, And it's a program that can easily be done in church basements, senior centers, and so on. It doesn't require a lot of high-tech equipment. So a study was done on this where people were invited to come into a program. They had a short visit with a nurse who also gave them some tip sheets about falls and nutrition, but basically they were then randomized to take part in a 6-month activity program of the nature I described. This is not putting people on treadmills and having them run, so many miles a day. This is a low-level program to take people wherever they are, just help move them along a continuum of physical activity. And after about 6 months, the intervention group had significant improvements in a number of measures of function by one of the common functional status measures we use. There were only a few people with depression, so we can't say really too much about that. So this study basically showed that you can develop a program that's easily doable in senior centers, lots of places, that get people better, not just putting them, not the ones that we just do in the laboratory with treadmills and so on. This program is actually interesting because Group Health, in its wisdom, actually offers this as a health benefit. So those of you who are members of Group Health, you can sign up for Enhanced Fitness or Lifetime Fitness, or you can sign up for the Silver Sneakers program, or you can sign up for both and be physically active. And basically, we did a study looking at people who enrolled in these programs, adjusted for their baseline health costs, and we're basically able to show that if you could get people to show up twice a week or more on average, they actually have reductions in health costs over time. So everybody generally has higher costs, but you can actually blunt that increase and have some reduction. I'd like to just give you a quick slide here, or DVD, to give you some sense of this program. Can we play that? This is a DVD that was made related to a national awards ceremony for the Enhanced Fitness program, but it gives you some flavor about the program and the kinds of things that can be done in a community.
Seattle, Washington, one of the world's centers for high tech, but it's produced something low tech as well. It's called Enhanced Fitness, and it's an exercise program focusing on seniors. Enhanced Fitness is a long-running partnership between the University of Washington, Group Health Cooperative, and Senior Services of Seattle, King County.
We started in '93 with a scientific study, so we based it on research, then disseminated in a few sites, and we're now in over 90 sites around the United States.
Putting a dent in our trade deficit, it's also been exported to Beijing, China. 3 times a week, certified instructors teach strength, flexibility, and aerobic conditioning. Enhanced Fitness also provides additional training to the instructors, specifically in the very important area of outcomes testing.
Our funders have been quite satisfied with the program because it takes very little money to put into the program to get it up and going and then to sustain it over time. And we've also found that funders like the fact that we're collecting the outcomes, that we can provide them not just with the number of people taking a class.
In addition to being extremely effective, the program is simple to implement.
Well, the only equipment that's required for the class are the soft wrist and ankle weights, and then hard back chairs, and that's why it's low tech. And the program also is sustainable. Once the weights are purchased, the only cost in the program is to pay the instructor's salary.
With continued positive outcomes for over 10 years, what's a good example of the individual impact?
We had one participant that lost 40 pounds. She was somebody that you wouldn't have ever expected to, first of all, come to the class, but then she not only came to the class and took care of all these health issues, she became an instructor. And I've heard more than one participant say this, that it truly saved their life.
But it is always best to start exercise early, like your 70s perhaps.
And you can get started at the age of 90. You don't need to start when you're 60 or 70. That's always best, of course. But we have people that start exercising in their 80s and 90s.
The Enhanced Fitness program has proven that partnerships work. And after 10 years of data, it is clear that a well-researched and implemented program is a lifesaver for people young and a little less young.
Now, that looks very nice, and it was nice for the program to get a national award. The question, though, that probably comes to your mind saying, well, these are people who already showed up. They went to a class. You don't have to motivate. Somehow they got motivated. how do we move people along who aren't that well motivated? So there's another series of studies of working in senior centers on a program called Enhanced Wellness, formerly the Health Enhancement Program, which was studied in which basically a nurse, it doesn't have to be a nurse, but in the studies it was a nurse, would meet with a client in a senior center, do a very simple intake about health risks, and then work with the client to develop a health action plan. And the entire program is focused around motivational interviewing. The nurse never ever says, something's not controlled, here's what you should do. And indeed, the people usually only meet with the nurse once and then have a number of phone calls. But the key thing is to develop a plan and figure out what resources are available to that person to do it. If they choose to do nutrition, if they choose to do physical activity, if they choose to work on depression, whatever it is, you take where they are and then help move them along. And even if you would like them to become physically active and they don't want to work on that, they want to work on something else, that's okay. You start there, you show that they can be effective in changing behavior, and then you come back to some of the other risks. So this is a program which puts a big premium, though, on trying to get people socially activated, more physically active, and then using programs like a Kate Lorig program that was developed in the Bay Area to help people develop their own self-management skills. It's a lay volunteer-led programs. They're available in large numbers of centers around this state. The outcomes in that study, again, were functional measures primarily, and some health utilization data. And another part of the health enhancement program is that it focuses on trying to create senior volunteers and mentors to help other seniors be active. And this gets into the whole question about meaningful social activation for the mentors as well. At the end of the initial study, there was a significant reduction in hospital bed days. Psychoactive medication use decreased by quite a bit. There were higher levels of physical activity, and there was better functioning in all kinds of activities of daily living. So this was a study that showed you could take people and help them identify things that they were at risk for in terms of potentially losing their functional independence, let them choose what they wanted to work on off that menu, and then helping move them along. We've done some follow-up on this. This program has now been disseminated to a number of states and a large number of senior centers. And follow-up programs of people no longer controlled trials, but people who come in at enrollment and then are followed up 1 year later, continue to show significant changes and improvement in things like depression and physical inactivity. There's also, on self-rated health, there's an improvement there as well. Now, the important part, another important part of this study, though, is that you've noticed that if you looked at the mentors, the people who are just being buddies to these individuals, people who are around to be counselors, help them develop their plans, call them every couple weeks, the mentors themselves also had significant improvement in their health outcomes. And this really gets to the crux of some of this issue about helping others, doing good for yourselves by doing good for others as well. And then lastly, on this interaction between motivation, chronic disease, physical activity, and depression, well, what do you do with the people who seem so depressed that the thought of becoming physically active is just not there? So to try to figure out a program that might work in a community that we could link to these other programs, a study was done called the PEARLS Intervention, a program to encourage active, rewarding lives for seniors. And you have a lot of this data in your handout, so I won't go through it in great detail. But basically, this was a study to train social workers who are doing social case management in a care agency to identify depression, moderate depression, and to do an intervention called problem-solving treatment to see if people could improve on that. It incorporated this thing called problem-solving treatment, which is a cognitive behavioral technique for those of you who like that kind of jargon. It was heavily linked to trying to increase social and physical activation and trying to set some goals around that. And also something just called pleasant event scheduling. And this is a simple thing like, Sadie, let's try to think of something between now and the next time I see you that might be fun to do, or something you thought might be fun to do that you haven't done. Can you think of anything? And indeed, if they can't think of anything, we actually have a list of a couple of hundred things people have thought about. And they can be very simple. It can be simply calling a friend, calling my sister who I haven't talked to for 20 years. But whatever it is, you go with where they are and you try to move them along a continuum and show them that they can figure out on their own how to move things along. And in this study, people were able to show a major improvement in depression in individuals, and there was not really significant changes in medication management of these individuals. The reasons for going through those three is that we now, if we go back to Mrs. Jones, we have an individual who, yes, we want her to be active, but just saying go be active won't be enough. The question is, how do we think of this whole constellation about her chronic disease, helping her feel comfortable exercising, what that will do to all those symptoms of arthritis and so on, and maybe even helping her deal with her depression a bit. This leads to a current intervention we're doing, and I'm only showing this not to tout the study because it's a very sloppy scientific study, but it's an awful lot of fun, which is to say, okay, how would we make this work in a community? And so what we've done, we're working with a number of community partners in Southeast Seattle. And we've taken a program that was developed in the Bay Area, a motivational support program using volunteers. And we're working with a couple of clinics in Southeast Seattle as well and the Southeast Senior Center to try to increase community capacity for physical activity. So in this study, we're trying to deal, if we go back to that social ecologic model and you say to me, you know, how do you deliver on this? What would it look like in a community? This is what we're currently dabbling with. So at an institutional link, we're trying to form clear linkages between clinical settings and community support systems for older adults. Not just hoping they happen, but trying to figure out how to make them happen in a regular way. We're doing a huge amount with trying to work with local institutions to increase physical activity, not just at the senior center, but in places like the Filipino Community Center, walking groups with Vietnamese elders. We're starting to develop some programs in for Cambodians as well. In the social environment, we're trying to build a cadre of peer supports, volunteer physical activity buddies. We would greatly like to increase the volunteer pool for people who would be walk leaders in various parts of Southeast Seattle. We'll begin this summer trying to deal with some issues around intergenerational programs, linking seniors to younger populations. And at some point, we have to deal with social marketing about how do we make all of this seem cool, and so on. At the physical environment issue, we're working around areas where seniors live, like some of the low-income housing areas, for some elders to look at the walkability of sidewalks around them, safety, some public safety issues, and doing a little bit with the police. And then also we're beginning to look at transportation corridors and how can people get to places where it's enjoyable to walk and be active. Lastly, at the policy level, I noted before that group health actually has a physical activity benefit for their seniors. And that could be a model for Medicare and Medicaid. Trying to deal with Medicare and Medicaid are major issues, and trying to figure out how to change policy where up front it looks like they might have to pay some money and sort through the whole issues about how do you construct a benefit for physical activity. Does it have to be in a certified program? What does a certified program look like? Do you pay people to go walk? It's hard to figure out how to create a health benefit around that, and yet everybody would benefit from it. So let's go back to Mrs. Jones for a minute and then close there. So ideally, in a new paradigm, rather than just throwing up your hands and saying, well, gosh, I don't know, Ms. Jones, you'll just have to go figure it out yourself, you would try to link her to some community resources. Another example of this is we're actually beginning to develop a website which will soon be up, hopefully by the end of June, which will have there's a good listing of all the good physical activity programs for seniors in King County. There's a working model already at the end of your handouts. You'll see a listing of some websites on these activities. There'd be lots of places for her to go to get self-management skill building, like these Kate Lorig classes I talked about. There would be safe and affordable opportunities for activity for people who can't afford to go to health clubs or hire personal trainers or pay $110 for good walking shoes or whatever. There will be accessible opportunities for meaningful social engagement. If you look at a lot of opportunities for elderly volunteers, they're really not too meaningful. There's a lot of front desk opportunities. You can come in and, put stamps on envelopes, do mailings, and so on. But for people to be meaningfully engaged in a way that they actually control programs, it's hard to find large numbers of places that are willing to give freedom to volunteers to do that. And ultimately, Mrs. Jones would get involved in a program where she is really in charge of her health program, and when she comes to see you, she has her agenda, and you do your best to help her meet it. So these are all issues that we need to think about as we talk simply about let's all go out and be active. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. LoGerfo and Dr. McCormick and Dr. Abras. And I'd like to have our three lecturers come up. And again, we respect people's needs to go catch the bus, go watch the Ladies Short program on the Olympics. But otherwise, make sure we come up to the microphones, and I'll try to alternate who I point to and ask some good questions. I'd like to start with you.
Hi. First of all, I want to say that it's so good to see doctors with a real compassion in their hearts. And I'm just really so proud to have just sat here and listened to doctors, not only speak on the medical, but on the human side of it. What I wanted to say was what the last doctor was talking about, how can we, meaning the health field, get senior citizens active. I'm just confused here for a moment. The United States have so much property and lands. Right here in Seattle, I look at it annually, where they have tax sales and they never sell all of this land. Why can't an organization with a health service like this in mind, why can't they petition to the city to allow a certain amount of that land and take that land and let the seniors and stuff, beautify it and stuff and make I shouldn't say make, but I know that the cities will give grants and money, cities, states, and other people give out money for certain programs. I can't see why that can't be done, so that the citizens and seniors are not so always every therapeutic is inside, but bring it outside and let them live outside as well as inside. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a great suggestion. There actually are large numbers of places already. I think the key issue is that mentality for, say, Parks and Rec. And Parks is beginning to work on this. So if you go to Seward Park now, they're beginning to think about, the cities always are concerned about liability. And what if something happens? What if we turn a program over to these seniors and something terrible happens? And when you read the headlines and how people like to bash politicians, you can understand why they get gunshot. But many of them are now beginning to come around and saying, this is a liability we should accept because it is good. But it's a slow process, but you're right on.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Jeff. I think my question is primarily for Dr. Abras, and it's about flexibility and how much does that contribute, and in what ways does it contribute to health?
Yeah, that's a good point, and Dr. LoGerfo did talk about the whole issue of endurance, strength, balance, and flexibility. And one of the things, of course, that we try to measure in a lot of these programs, for example, are falls and preventing falls. And clearly when we're looking at those kind of things, then balance and flexibility along with strength and endurance make a difference. I think some of the best studies have shown that Tai Chi, for example, which does have a lot of balance and flexibility in it besides the issue of endurance, has a significant impact in reducing the number of falls that older individuals have. So I think that's all part of it. Yeah, definitely. And the other thing somebody asked me during the break was the issue is when I was giving you examples, I talked about formal exercise programs because those are easier for us to measure. We know how much exercise people do and all. But the word is really activity. It doesn't have to be a formal exercise program, and gardening and housework and all those count as activity as well. It's just harder for us to figure out what that is. So when someone says, I do a half hour of gardening every day, that isn't necessarily the same one person to the next. So when we do our studies, it's hard to measure that, but that doesn't mean that gardening and all those other activities aren't important. And again, when you do that, you do more than just strength. You do, if you bend over, you bend your knees, you stretch, whatever, those are all important as part of it. So it's a balance thing that involves all four things, not one or the other.
Thank you.
You gave the example of Miss Jones who lives in South Seattle. So I wanted to hypothesize that she may live in the city of SeaTac. And if she lives in the city of SeaTac, she has a real problem. The first problem is there is no licensed physicians in the city of SeaTac. That's first off. Then the second problem is there's no facilities, no medical facilities in the city of SeaTac. And yet there's many seniors there needing services. And it would be really nice, it's interesting, I live in the city of SeaTac, and we have an airport, but we also need another port for services, medical services to seniors and everybody else who lives in the city of SeaTac. And I would like to pro-offer some organization like University of Washington or Public Health or however that fleshes out to come to an outreach in the city of SeaTac and help some of our senior citizens.
I think that's a great suggestion. In terms of CTAC, there are some programs that the county has. There's called a Healthier Steps program that's trying to do more with physical activity across the whole age spectrum in CTAC directly. And I don't know the situation about senior centers, though, but we'll follow up on it.
Thanks for sharing that with us. Yes?
I'm a retired teacher, and I'd like to volunteer in a senior center. I live in Olympia. Where can I find training? I don't have any background or training in physical activity. I'd like to do that kind of thing and work as a mentor or work, but I don't know where to go.
This is a great question. There's some simple, immediate things. I don't know what the resources are in Olympia. I would first see if there are senior centers
There is.
there,
Yeah.
and
two good senior centers with activities.
Right, and whether they offer a program like the Enhanced Wellness Program, where they actually provide training for individuals to, say, run these lay volunteer groups about self-management.
They have programs, but not training.
Then they may be able to, if you want to send me an email, I might be able to work with you directly. But more to the question for the general group, this whole issue about seniors helping seniors is a terrific avenue to think about. So there's actually some people now thinking nationally about this whole issue about being peer buddies and so on. The skills are generic about being a good buddy, about motivational supports and so on, whether you're doing it to help people change nutrition or physical activity or depression. So we're actually just beginning to explore in a way, what are those core skills and how would you create large number of volunteer programs so somebody could go to a senior center and say, I've been trained as a Kate Lorig, whatever. Can you use me? And you hope the response to them will be, thank you, yes.
Thanks.
It really does become a positive snowballing thing. So, if you were interested, you might be able to get that.
Sir?
Many of my friends are getting new hips, knees, shoulders, and whatever. Is this related to too much exercise, not enough exercise, wrong diet, or what? Is it preventable?
Clearly, injuries are probably a major part related to that. People who've had injuries clearly develop more problems in the joint that they've injured rather than the other one. It's that, the old joke about, my left knee hurts. Well, what do you expect? You're old, but my other knee isn't, It's the same old story. So trauma is really very important. The other is when people do develop arthritis and have these joint problems, what I said before really holds true. As they use it less, it becomes weaker, and as they become weaker, they have more and more trauma. So again, the whole issue of doing the right exercise, of strengthening it, does improve it. The other thing is, yes, people are living longer, and they are generally having more chronic kind of problems with their joints that we used to not see before. But trauma and proper use of the joint is probably the major contributor, besides a few people, maybe 10% of the population, that has underlying genetic disorders of their joints that are going to have problems no matter what we do, just because they have that abnormality. But for the majority of people, it does relate to trauma and strength and using the joint properly.
Yes, I got a question on
memory and dementia. You mentioned physical exercise may help some of these symptoms or delay the onset of these symptoms, but is there any mental exercise or memory exercise that people could use to delay the onset of such things? One reason I ask is in the Chinese community, there's a movement in the nursing homes to start letting the patients play mahjong, which is a game that is very addictive. They find out the seniors respond a lot quicker and have better mental capability when they play the game. Unfortunately, take 4 people to play the game and they sit down all day, so it's not very physically active. But if you draw on that line, is there any exercise in memory or mental exercise, maybe crossword puzzle, that you could prescribe to seniors to help their memory and dementia?
Well, yes, actually, it's great that you bring that up, because I mentioned only physical exercise in the study, but there have been a number of actually randomized controlled trials using different kinds of memories in places where seniors congregate. And in fact, there was one using mahjong in older individuals. There have been other mental exercises used in other Asian communities, Japanese and Korean. And mentioning crossword puzzles, card games, anything that's engaging and requires planning and calculation does seem to have something to do with delaying the effects of dementia. So you're onto something that is a very real phenomenon. Thinking exercises do seem to help delay the effects in some of the same ways that the physical exercise does.
It's a wonderful question. Yes, ma'am?
Does the time of day that you exercise have any significance?
Not that we know of. Any time's good, as long as it's safe and you get some in.
I was thinking if you exercise first thing in the morning and then you're sedentary the rest of the day, is that beneficial?
Well, if you do it, it's worth doing at any time of day. So
Thank you.
It's better than being sedentary all day.
No, I think to answer that question is, there is the discussion of should you do it in the morning, should you do it in the afternoon. I think most of the data suggests that people who exercise in the morning are more adherent to their exercise programs, and people who do their exercise in the afternoon have a higher level of performance. So you can make that. Depends on whether you think it's important, but that's been done several times. But no, you don't lose the benefit over the day. That's too short a time. When I said stop exercising, I'm talking about people who stop exercising, not who don't exercise for several hours. So you get the benefit no matter when you do it.
Just quickly, I was going to comment that along with exercise and crossword puzzles and games, reading and musical instruments I had heard were beneficial.
Yeah, music is particularly useful. In people who are having difficulty with their memory already, sometimes it's difficult to stick with a long story in a book. But things like music that are engaging in short-term tasks or memories are much more stimulating and seem to be more helpful.
Doctors, ladies and gentlemen, thank you.